Hello, friends. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Wilhelm Visitant III, but you can call me Will. On this episode, we will explore eerie true tales about increasingly disturbing phenomena. So relax, turn down the lights, and wrap up into something comforting because you're about to get the Willies. I remember in the late 90s coming home from work to my roommate sitting there shaking. He, let's call him Terrence, told me before I came home from my night shift that he and his girlfriend Sally witnessed something terrifying. He started by recollecting about how they had come home from a night out on the town and were, as he called it, snickered. They were enjoying their evening, listening to music and talking at home, but sleep was pulling them closer to their bed. He said he remembered having his girlfriend next to him on the bed and then closing his eyes. He woke up to a strange feeling in his gut and sweat all over his face and body. As the sleep left his eyes, and when he could begin focusing on the world around him, he noticed something hanging above him on the ceiling. He pulled the covers over his head and began breathing heavily, for what he saw was like nothing he had ever seen before. There was something floating above him like a blob of brown and red, exposed by outside light shining through the bedroom blinds. The blob seemed to have veins and rippled like thick oil on top of waves of water. As he clenched his covers with white knuckles and sweated even more, his girlfriend began to stir. She ducked under the covers, and with a soft tone, almost slurred speech, an utterance provided by very deep sleep, asked, What's wrong? He couldn't speak. He just stared at her wide-eyed, with veins pumping full of adrenaline, and a tired mind filled with confusion and apprehension. She asked another question softly, but with more concern. Are you okay? Terrence's lips were quivering, but he managed to muster. There's something in the room. Sally started to frown and gripped his hand with hers. And I really don't know what it is. Terrence told me it seemed to take Sally an eternity to pull the covers down and look around the room, but she did. Directly above her she saw an oily, rusty-colored thing, a form hanging over her. It hung in the air above them, almost as if it was observing the two lovers. Sally quickly went under the covers, and with a shaking voice and quivering hands asked Terrence, What the hell is that thing? Terrence was a boxer. Believe me when I say he could take many men down with very few blows. This powerhouse of a person who knew how to fight was terrified. If Terrence is afraid, a lot of us should be afraid as well. Terrence looked at Sally in the eyes with complete conviction and with urgency. We have to get out of this room now. Sally began to tear up, nodded her head in agreement. Before they could flee, they would both slowly pull the covers away from their heads to view the mysterious presence one last time, and what they saw shook them to their core. Terrence and Sally witnessed a face emerging from the gelatinous hovering blob above them. He said it was like no face he had ever seen before. It was a face, but it was so hideous and so demented that he couldn't match it to any other horrific face he had ever seen in his lifetime. The eyes stared at the couple, and the thing's mouth opened as if it were about to say something. Both of the lovers screamed so loud they almost forgot how to breathe. They both ran out of the room, out of the apartment, and into the streets. Their neighbor came outside. He heard the screaming. He made sure everyone was all right after he was told about the apparition. Floating above the bed, he politely and lovingly walked into the apartment alone and into Terrence's room. When his neighbor came outside after inspecting the situation, he seemed confused because he had found nothing. And that's the story relayed to me by my friend Terrence, a strange eyewitness account of a thing, or a form, or something that scared them both in an indelible and acute manner. My friend told me a story about a strange incident her mother Marcy experienced in the late 90s. Back then, her mother was a very busy and well-respected chef at a local Italian restaurant in their small town. She worked a very long shift that evening and was exhausted. When Marcy got home, she had a quick snack and then went upstairs to bed. After she got under the covers, she was struck by how much the moonlight was spilling in through her bedroom windows. She fluffed her pillow, pulled her covers over her exhausted body, and began to sleep. Hours later, she was awakened by an unfamiliar sound in the room. She thought perhaps it was just the wind because the weather of late spring brought winds that would sometimes knock over articles in her room, especially next to her bed. One time, the wind had even knocked over her favorite framed picture of her family she kept by her bed. Marcy looked around just to make sure she wasn't being visited by her husband, who slept in the other room next to hers. Occasionally, he would come in to use the en-suite bathroom in her bedroom, which was closer than the bathroom down the hall, but there was no husband, and there was no sign of her possessions being knocked over by the wind. She closed her eyes and fell back to sleep. Again, she was startled awake from the blackness of sleep. Marcy looked at her clock on the nightstand next to the bed. It was roughly 3:30 a.m., only 20 minutes since she last woke. She heard something in her room make a sound. She had been so deep into sleep that she didn't know what the sound was, but Marcy knew deep down a peculiar sound had been made because she sat up in bed frightened. She got up out of bed and found no husband coming into the bathroom, nor any wind blasting through the windows knocking over her possessions. She went to all 3 of her windows in the bedroom and shut them tightly, just to make sure she would not be awakened again. My friend's mother didn't have to work the next day, but was concerned she was not sleeping properly. Marcy walked around the room for a minute, leafed through a magazine, and finally, exhaustion overcame her, and she was too tired to keep her eyes open. She began to sleep again. Within what seemed like minutes, Marcy jolted up in bed, looked around the room. Something was making noise and not revealing itself to her. Her brow had sweat on it as well as her lips. She felt a chill that wasn't from any wind, but from the fright of feeling eyes targeting her. She looked over at the small sofa in front of the bed and saw a figure crouched behind it. Marcy gasped. She clenched her bed sheets and couldn't speak. Marcy sat there, inert, staring at the silhouette of an amorphous thing that was slowly morphing into a face and body by the soft sheen of bright moonlight. As her eyes began to slowly acclimate to the dark, Marcy recognized her good friend Joanne of 20 years. Joanne didn't speak. She just squatted there, producing an unusually wide grin. Joanne began waving a slow, impish greeting while staying crouched. She turned and began to crawl behind the sofa at a very fast pace. Marcy got out of bed tentatively and walked over to investigate. She slowly approached the sofa and looked behind it. To her dismay, there were only 3 inches of space between the sofa and the wall. There was no room for anyone to crawl behind it. She could not find her friend and could not go back to sleep. The sun finally came up. Marcy had drunk many cups of coffee, thinking repeatedly of the event that unfolded that early morning. There was no explanation, and it seemed surreal. She didn't think it was any sort of dream. And then the phone rang. Marcy had a call from a friend of hers. It was the husband of the lady she witnessed crawling behind her sofa that morning. He was crying and wanted to tell her his wife, Marcy's dear friend of 20 years, had passed away around 3 o'clock that morning in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. The Appalachian Mountains have a different feel to them. There's something sleeping there, something arcane. Many claim the ancient mountains contain thin places where there is a connection to another world. Are these claims true? I can't say for sure. All I can say is if you grew up in Appalachia, you probably have a story. This is mine. I was 10 years old. I lived on Reed Mountain in Roanoke, Virginia with my family. Our area was beautiful, if not a little isolated. My cousins had come to visit from Florida. The kids had a lot of energy, but it was drizzling, and there wasn't much to do. The grown-ups decided we could all pile in my uncle's van and drive up to Mill Mountain. At the top of the mountain there's a huge star that is lit up at night. In front of that is a lookout where you can view a gorgeous panorama of the glowing city of Roanoke. I remember the drive to Mill Mountain. Everyone was laughing and sharing stories, just generally catching up. We were all having a great time. As we approached the road that snakes up the mountain, the details of our surrounding began to diminish with shadow. If you've never been to the mountains at night, let me set the tone. The roads are often winding, with rock or thick vegetation on one side and a steep drop-off on the other. When I say dark, I mean you can see nothing without a light source. So if you're driving on these roads at night, especially if you are from a flat or often well-lit place like Florida, you take your time, which is what we did. As the road took us further and further up the mountain, I remember feeling very at ease and happy to visit with my family. Out of the intense darkness, a wraith-like figure of a woman materialized on the side of the road. This ghostly figure appeared opalescent as she was dressed completely in vintage white clothing. Not a wedding dress, just all white clothes that looked old. Her dark hair was stringy and damp. She wasn't wearing shoes, and she carried a tattered carpet bag. She walked nonchalantly, like walking on a pitch-black road on the side of a mountain was completely normal. We passed by her slowly, the adults gawking, just as much as the kids. No one spoke. We were all thinking the same thing. She looks like a ghost. She never looked up, never acknowledged that we were there. She just kept walking. Once she was out of sight, we all begged my uncle to turn around. It sounds easy, but again, mountain roads are different. We had to wait until there was a turnoff to safely turn around and drive back. Once we got back to where we had seen her, she had disappeared. The events of that night still haunt me as an adult. How could a shoeless woman maneuver with such eerie assurance along the dark mountainside road without feeling around her with her hands or feet? How did our bright van lights not startle or even momentarily stop her? For a moment I thought maybe she was on drugs or having a psychotic break, but again, she wasn't acting erratic, just walking calmly. It honestly looked like she was in two places at once, two worlds. Everyone in the car, adults and children, felt it. Last week, when I took my daughter to the dentist, and I was waiting for her to get done, I overheard a woman tell one of the staff not to sweep under her feet, or she'll never marry. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That was an Appalachian superstition. I knew because I had been researching it for 2 days prior. I asked her where she was from, and she said North Carolina. We got to talking about Appalachian superstitions and lore. I told her the story of the woman on Mill Mountain, and how it bothered me so much that she was walking in total darkness. barefoot and was perfectly at ease. The woman didn't bat an eye and said, "They like to follow lines." I've been an RN my entire adult life. I've always been a fan of ghost stories and haunted places. It wasn't until a few years ago into my nursing career where I realized I hadn't heard a lot about hauntings in hospitals. Sure, there are the abandoned asylums and TB hospitals and a handful of others known to be haunted, but what about modern, still functioning establishments? It piqued my interest when a call light from an empty room kept lighting up. Now, it couldn't have been a glitch in the power grid or someone playing a prank on me, but it got me thinking. Not sure if the previous occupant had passed in there, but that particular unit did a lot of end-life care, so there had been more than one death in that room, and most of the time, sadly, it was a messy, undignified one. Nurses tend to have the best stories of what they have encountered on the job, so I'm sure if I asked around, I was bound to find a good one about the paranormal. My favorite came from a nurse named Kim, who was one of the best I've ever worked with. Smart, compassionate, an all-around great human being. She used to work at the #1 trauma center where you literally see everything. There was a horrible instance on the labor and delivery unit where 2 women back-to-back died in childbirth in the same room. I'm sure that shook everyone there to the core. Not long after, there were complaints from patients, usually in the middle of the night, that there were 2 women chatting in the room, and it was keeping them awake. This happened enough to have all the obvious explanations ruled out, the biggest one being the staff chatting at the nurse's station. Finally, administration was made aware. Their solution was having a priest come in and bless the room. From what I gathered from the story, the complaints of hearing the 2 women greatly decreased and ceased altogether. According to Kim, if you look behind the TV in that room, you will see a crucifix attached. Again, I don't have first-hand account of this. For all I know, it could be a nursing urban legend. However, there's a lot to this story that makes it believable, much like my call light experience. I'm sure there are things that have happened on the job that nurses or other healthcare workers simply cannot explain. When science is defied, where can we look to find the answers to explain these strange occurrences? And if I may be so bold, where better would hauntings occur than in modern, functioning hospitals? From the strange to the supernatural to the downright terrifying, these stories seem to reveal a veil that thinly divides 2 worlds, ours and another, perhaps mysterious one. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope it gave you something to ruminate on. If you have a story that sticks to your gut and haunts your thoughts, feel free to submit it to the email address in the comments below to have it featured on our show. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and come back next time for a dastardly dose of the Willies.